Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to try to give you sort of like a brief introduction to early modern philosophy. What is it? Why is it important? Why do we still read it today? The normal format for these sort of videos is that I'm going to be discussing whatever it is that you're assigned to read for this week. So, normally I would be talking about Montesquieu, Bacon, and Galileo because that's the reading that you have for the first week. But really, those are sort of like background primers for like being able to enter the world of early modern philosophy. So I'm going to be mentioning them a little bit in the video for today, but it's going to be a little bit less focused, more interested in giving you a survey on what this course is going to be about in general and why it is so important to the development of philosophy. I mentioned in the previous video where I was explaining the course procedures and the syllabus that this class is really pivotal for a lot of reasons for the development of a philosophy student. One of the main reasons why is because almost all Western philosophy in the 20th and 21st century positions itself as a response to the sort of problems in early modern philosophy. Or if they don't necessarily characterize themselves as a response to like one or more of the problems in early modern philosophy, they will at least sort of say like, well, what makes my approach unique is that I'm breaking with the early modern tradition. So it's really important both for understanding sort of like the traditional way that people approach problems in the Western philosophical tradition, especially in the 20th century, but then it's also really important if you are interested in maybe more contemporary philosophy or Heidegger or something like that, that positions itself as a rejection of the basic approach taken by all of the authors that we're going to be examining, then you really need to know it very well too. So really, kind of no matter what you're doing, if you're working in the world of Western philosophy and you're working after the 17th century, then virtually all of the stuff that we're going to be going through in this course is vitally important for the development of those philosophical traditions. And so being able to unpack why exactly that is, like why is it that the 17th century instead of the 15th century or the 7th century or whatever else in European history, or why in Europe rather than someone else, like why are we looking at this specific constellation of figures that we think about as being early modern philosophy? I've sort of given you a little bit of a timeline here. I hope that you don't mind. My writing is a little messy. I'll try to read everything out so that it's a little bit more clear. So one thing that I mentioned in the previous video is that early modern philosophy is more or less synonymous with the phrase Descartes to Kant, because it's generally seen that Descartes is the beginning of this philosophical tradition and Kant is the end of it. Now, what you get after Kant, that's like a matter of a lot of contention. Is it like late modern philosophy? Are you starting to move sort of into postmodern philosophy? To what extent? When does that happen? Those are all pretty controversial, but it's relatively uncontroversial, and this is kind of an unusual thing in philosophy. Often any sort of periodization is going to be contested. But this specific characterization of early modern philosophy as beginning with Kant and beginning with Descartes and ending with Kant's critique of pure reason, that's more or less uncontroversial. And the reason why is because there's a relatively closed domain of philosophical problems and approaches that take off in the 17th and 18th centuries. And almost all philosophers that work in philosophy departments in the Western tradition are expected to know virtually everything that is contained in this class. And so that's part of why I think the class is really exciting and very important, is that you start developing so many of the problems that are going to stay with philosophy for centuries and centuries. Obviously, there have been cases where this has happened before, right? You have centuries of commentary on Plato and Aristotle, for example, to continue in the Western tradition. You have centuries of commentary and analysis of Buddhist texts in non-Western traditions. And so it's not exactly unparalleled. But I would say that it is very rare for philosophical events to have the sort of importance that, say, like Descartes' Meditations had for the development of history, world history as a whole. And part of getting through this course is going to be trying to understand why. What are the sort of problems that are encountered by Descartes and modified by Spinoza or whoever else that remains so vitally important for us today? So just to read out some of the things that I put on the timeline. I started out with Descartes' Meditations. We're actually going to be talking about some historical events that predate Descartes' Meditations. The glare seems a little bad maybe there, but it says 1641 is Descartes' Meditations. And then, roughly 30 years later, you get the publication of Spinoza's Ethics. That's another very important book that we're going to be reading excerpts from. In 1690, you had the publication of Locke's Essay on Human Understanding. This is going to be very important for empiricists, and we'll talk more about that distinction in a second. You have a dispute about the discovery of calculus between Leibniz and Newton that happens in roughly 1699. And so then you have Du Châtelet's Foundations of Physics, which attempts sort of like a metaphysical grounding of the physical sciences of the sort that we find in Newton and Bacon, Galileo, and similar other figures that we're going to be examining. And then finally, you have Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Generally, this book is considered the end of the period for reasons that we'll understand as we approach basically the end of the course. It's less important that you remember any of these specific dates or the fact that I put these readings on the timeline instead of some other readings. The point really is just to see really the speed at which all of this happens, So you have the publication of Descartes' Meditations, and then only a couple of decades later, you have the next canonical text, which is undisputably a response to Descartes' Meditations that comes from Spinoza. And then similarly, you have figures that Leibniz, who comments on Spinoza, happening only a couple of decades later, and so on. So things move relatively quickly in this timeline. Even though that might seem like maybe not so quickly, you can easily go centuries, or at least I know various centuries. There are various centuries where I don't know of any philosophical work that was published during that time. So like the amount that we find important and continue to read and still find important from this period is extremely remarkable compared to, like, say, I would say like general knowledge of the 7th century AD or something like that. So really you can see that quite a lot is happening very quickly. And so to understand why and understand like what are the conditions under which an enormous amount of philosophical material that we still consider extremely important can be published in such a relatively short period of time, we have to start to understand the context behind a lot of these discoveries. And so that means sort of understanding a lot of what's going on in Europe in the 16th century, the 17th century, is sort of background for our investigations into early modern philosophy. And essentially what I want to say about that is that now we think of religion, natural science, and philosophy as being very distinct domains, right? There are theologians, and there are philosophers, and there are natural scientists, and all of those are different, right? For us, you can't study biology in a religious studies department, or at least I imagine that would be very difficult. And, so too with the reverse, right? But Descartes, for example, a figure that we're going to be examining in more detail next week, Descartes was in some sense, religious authority in some sense. Like he tried to write doctrines about the nature of God, right? He was a natural scientist. He conducted experiments on animals. He dissected a lot of animals. He developed the Cartesian coordinate plane. He's very interested in the developments of natural science. And he's also obviously a philosopher, right? And previously, we wouldn't even really hold very much of a distinction between philosophy and natural science. Oftentimes, what would happen is figures like the ones we're going to be examining would call themselves natural philosophers. And the basic idea is that they were going to describe the nature of the world, and to do that sort of just meant giving an account of whether or not the world includes a God in it, for example, or explaining how certain physical interactions with heat or light or whatever else makes sense. Or, and so a lot of this stuff really comes together. You can see this in some other figures that like I haven't put on the board or that we won't even read in this class. For example, Pascal was very interested in developing natural scientific experience, but also writing philosophy. And so a lot of the figures that we're examining are, at least in some sense, natural scientists, and they are also, at least in some sense, theologists. They're thinkers about the nature of God and how the nature of God can coexist with our understanding of God's creation, right? The finite physical interactions that we can study, say like a ball rolling down a hill, right? And so the position of the philosopher as sort of being like between religion and science is going to be absolutely central to development of this period. You might have seen that I wrote Scholasticism on this board. This is sort of like the philosophy that's in the background against which a lot of these early modern philosophers are responding to. This was sort of like philosophical tradition that was broadly theological in character and also developed a lot from sort of Aristotelian ideas. And in general, the purpose of scholasticism is to sort of explain phenomena from the basis or position of religious authority. So, one way that you might pose a problem is you could say, like, why do finches of a particular species develop a beak in a certain way? Like, this is the sort of question that, like, Darwin would investigate in The Origin of Species, which is well after the philosophy that we're going to be examining. And his approach to this question is going to be one that we would recognize as a natural scientific one. We would just start to say, okay, well, there's natural selection, there's evolution, and so what happens is that certain features are adaptive or maladaptive to a certain environment that causes those organisms to breed rather than other ones, and that causes sort of genetic drift in the species. Blah, blah, blah. That is sort of what we would accept as sort of like now a natural scientific sort of explanation of, say, like a finch's beak or something like that. And importantly, this sort of explanation is not teleological, or at least not strongly teleological. And so I'm just going to write this on the board. Teleology. This is going to be something that's pretty important for us to understand and talk about. You might be familiar with it with some of your other classes. But one way of explaining, say, like why finches have a certain beak or something like that is to say that, like, well, this is God's creation. And God created, a species of finch with the appropriate beak to be able to, crack open nuts, to be able to live in whatever, Galapagos Islands or wherever else, right? And so this sort of explanation makes an appeal to someone who's like in artisan. This makes appeal to an artisan, namely like someone who, the basic insight, okay, I'm going to cut all this, but anyway, the basic insight is this, namely that you think of the world as if the worlds were created by an engineer, right? In the same way that we can say, like, you know, if there's a single gear that goes wrong in a watch, that can disrupt the entire mechanism of the watch. And so when we ask, like, why are these gears sort of placed up so that they line up together, we would make an appeal to the creator of that artifact. We would say, well, you know, whatever engineer, whatever company, Rolodex, or, you know, whatever, they created the watch such that it would work in this way because that was the intent of its creator. And so these are the sort of explanations that are given by scholasticism for natural phenomena, which is, you know, why, if you want to start to answer the question, why is the world the way that it is, then scholastic sort of explanations begin with, well, that is the way that God, as sort of artisan of the world, creator of the world, wanted the world to have been. It fits harmoniously with God's intention. And so here you can see sort of like a desire for explanation of natural phenomena ends up appealing to a kind of religious authority, right? Because who ultimately knows what God's intentions are? Well, the religious authorities ultimately say that they have access to that through the Bible or, you know, whatever other mechanism, right? And so you can kind of see how with scholasticism, the attempt to give sort of teleological model of explanation, you're appealing to, you know, what you understand to be the purposes of God, right? And that's just like a very different style of explanation than we would accept in a natural scientific context. Instead of explaining a finite interaction, namely, you know, a finch's beak in this case, by means of other finite things, so like Darwin looks at the environment, he looks at the notion of natural selection and heritability, and all of those features to sort of blend together a suitable explanation for a particular phenomena that happens. And scholasticism sort of circumvents all of that by making direct appeal to the insights of God, for example. And so, as you can imagine, for the scholastic, these sort of explanations are based in their religious, it's based in the church's religious authority, and that there's an inherent tension between the sort of explanations that are offered by scholastic sort of explanations and the emergence of natural science. And really, this tension is going to kind of define the features or dimensions of early modern philosophy. You have the emergence of a natural scientific attitude towards the world. And here we can see, you know, here's why we're looking at the 17th century instead of any other period. You know, okay, and so for some context, Luther's 95 Theses, that was in 1517. So already you see sort of like a fracturing of Christianity into Protestantism and Catholicism. It's beginning of the Protestant Reformation. It's the beginning of the church losing a significant amount of authority in Europe. It's the beginning of this idea that people should be able to determine for themselves religious beliefs and should be able to determine for themselves, like, say, you know, what God's intentions are for their life, and to move away from the way that the church had sort of institutionalized its power by means of things like tithes and so on. And so you have the context of Martin Luther and the 95 Theses in the 16th century, sort of like beginning this outburst of like religious disagreement that's going to foment all across Europe. You also have in the 16th century Copernicus. Copernicus's analysis of the revolution of planets. You also have, roughly during this couple of centuries, you have Kepler, you have Galileo, you have Descartes himself, who was an important natural scientist in his own right. Cartesian coordinate plane is very important. And so you have all of these emerging insights into the nature of reality, into the physical world that we inhabit, coming from a natural scientific standpoint, and that all of these insights that are coming from the natural scientific standpoint require, in some sense, a revision or an overturning of religious orthodoxy. So just to consider a couple of examples. So Copernicus, so the idea of heliocentrism, that our galaxy revolves around the sun rather than all of the planets revolving around Earth, geocentrism. So this idea is very important if you study astronomy or physics or related science. But really what is absolutely so significant about this idea, and philosophers will often refer to it as a Copernican revolution, is the idea that human beings are not at the center of the galaxy. This requires some overturning of religious authority, because what the scholastics said at the time was that, of course, we were, at the center of the galaxy because human beings are created in God's image. And so God naturally places human beings at the center of the universe as a whole, not only the galaxy, but the entire universe. Right? And so the idea that there are other planets and that those other planets are revolving around the sun rather than the Earth, and that we sort of inhabit just one planet that just happens to be within an inhabitable terrain of temperature and contingently, is in the perfect spot that's hospitable to life. All of this goes completely against the idea that the world is teleologically ordered, that it's set up to be as good as possible for us. And it requires us to adopt the perspective of sort of like an indifferent universe towards our own existence. And obviously, this is something that strikes at the heart of scholastic thinking, because it really undermines the whole notion of teleological explanations, and it becomes very difficult to understand, like, if there is a God, and if God did order the universe in such a way to be as good as possible for us, why would we not be at the center of the universe? And this is reflected in the fact that Galileo in the 17th century, so like a little bit before Descartes, he is publishing his own natural scientific findings. He's arguing in favor of a heliocentric model of the galaxy, and he's reprimanded by the church. He's actually placed on house arrest. And certain sort of like philosophers are going to be examining, like Descartes was going to publish a book called The World, until he saw what happened to Galileo, and then he had to revise his whole manuscript with the knowledge that religious authorities were going to be censoring him, that if he said the wrong things, that he could really be in hot water in the same way that Galileo did, and so on, right? So in this case too, you see a direct response from religious authority to Galileo for asserting what is ultimately the truth, which is that the galaxy revolves around the sun, and that we don't need, epicycles to explain the movements of the planets and so on. Another example that might be, a little bit hard for us to grasp because it's so far from, I think, our modern way of thinking, is Kepler, right? So Johannes Kepler argued that planets don't actually revolve in perfect circles. They actually revolve in epicycles. And this has to do with the nature of gravity, how gravity works on bodies, so on and so forth. But this, too, grated against religious orthodoxy, because the idea previously was that spheres are the best shape. The reason why they're the best shape is because they have no imperfections. Every point is at an absolutely equal distance from the center. That's what defines a circle or a sphere. And so God created heavenly, heavenly objects, the planets, in perfect spheres, and he made them revolve around us in perfect spheres, because that would be the most perfect and harmonious way to order the universe. That's part of what goes along with a teleological model of explanation, is that you have to have some idea of like, okay, well, here's what a perfect universe would be like, and our universe has to be like that, because that's how God would create the universe. And so Kepler's insight that planets actually revolve in epicycles rather than perfect circles, even though to us this is rather a banal insight, it seems like very little about the nature of religion really hangs on how the planets revolve in our model of the galaxy. But for religious authority, this is another case where a natural scientific perspective required the rejection of church teachings, and not only like this one individual dogma that they happen to have at this time, but also the general approach to understanding events and phenomena in the world, right? This is reflected to some extent in the Bacon that you read, or might not have read yet, but will read for this week. Bacon makes a very important point where he says that, if we can overturn our entire sense of the galaxy and the universe, namely from the geocentric model to a heliocentric model, then we have to accept that many of our fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality are wrong, right? That's a fundamental requirement to shift from the sort of scholastic position of religious authority to further development to natural sciences. You have to say, okay, well, this absolutely central dogma of the church was wrong, and one that they were willing, obviously to place Galileo on house arrest for. So they're wrong, right? Supposing that they are wrong about that, then now you have to enter the question of like, okay, well, in how many of the dogmas of the church during this period are wrong, and how many of those do we use in our reasoning on a day-to-day basis that are completely unfounded, right? And so this is why Bacon suggests a model where we turn to the natural sciences. He says, hey, what's important in explanations is not connecting your explanation to God. So it's less important that we, in trying to explain a particular phenomena, make appeal to like maybe the most universal sort of explanation that we can possibly give, which is like, hey, the universe is structured in a certain way, it has a creator, the creator would create it using these guidelines for whatever reason, and like this is how the universe would turn out. And instead Bacon says, well, if we want to explain phenomena, then we should use like the closest adjacent phenomena that we can know and understand. So instead of appealing, in the case of the Finches example that I gave earlier, it's less important for Bacon to sort of give the religious sort of explanation, scholastic explanation, even though he didn't have access to the findings that Darwin had or anything like that. The mode of explanation that he suggests in the text that we assign is a broadly empiricist experimental scientist. So you have the sense in this period from Bacon and a number of other people that like, if the fundamental model of the universe is wrong, then we have to start from scratch. We have to start reorienting our beliefs. We have to discover a new method for approaching our beliefs that can accurately capture the way that the world is. And we need to rely less on church dogmas and focus more on scientific sort of explanations, experimental phenomena that, we can publish small findings about the nature of the world and continually aggregate this true information together rather than begin from a foundation that might be completely false and wrong. And this idea of starting from new foundations, we're going to discover, is extremely important for Descartes. You even have the sense from some religious figures. So, for example, in the Montesquieu that you're going to be reading for this week, Montesquieu analyzes the ways that our senses are imperfect, that they are finite. In being finite, they have certain restrictions, right? Like in terms of like how far we can see or how well that we can see it. There are various sort of restrictions on that. Human beings have a certain distance that they can reliably see, and this can be augmented with technology. But Montesquieu's point is that this is a fundamentally kind of imperfect knowledge, that as finite, it's always subject to revision. And for Montesquieu, the takeaway here is that we would contrast our finite knowledge, which comes from the senses, and which tells us various things about the world, but which can be revised, with the knowledge of God. Now, unlike us, God's powers are not limited for Montesquieu in various ways. Like God doesn't have like human eyes, God has God's eyes, right? Which sees everything. And so doesn't have the same sort of restrictions that our own knowledge does. And so Montesquieu's point in his essay is really to say something about the nature of religious authority and knowledge. And what he wants to say is really that our capacity to achieve knowledge is fundamentally finite and limited. And this can be examined just by how reliant we are on our senses. And our senses are anthropological features about us as human beings. And so as limited in various respects, like dogs can smell better than we do, and various birds see better than we do, and so on. If all of our knowledge is based on these imperfect facts about human nature, then it occupies a very different sphere than the knowledge of God, which Montesquieu thinks is reflected in religious authority. There are various sort of questions that you can ask about, like, well, how is that possible? And those are things that we're going to go into there. But what you can see on Montesquieu is a generally sort of empiricist approach to philosophy, which means that he wants to argue for the centrality of our senses and our experience for our knowledge. We know things because we sense them, because we go out into the world to experiment and so on. But Montesquieu also combines this empiricism with a kind of skepticism that goes like, okay, well, and because we get all of our knowledge through the senses, and the senses are finite, that we have to draw a fundamental contrast between the sort of knowledge that's available to us, that's always revisable, that is always subject to change, that we know is occasionally non-veridical, which means that when you perceive something that it's like not the way that things really are. In the same way that, like, if you drop a pen or a pencil in a glass of water, then the water will bend the light. And so we will see the pen or the pencil as if it were bent because of the mediation of light in our vision. And so Montesquieu's point is that if we can be wrong about all of this stuff, then really we can be wrong about all of our knowledge. And so the finitude of human knowledge as a whole, for Montesquieu, should point us in the direction of the importance of religion as offering something that is not finite, that has an absolute kind of knowledge that comes directly from God, presumably from the Bible or wherever. Now, Bacon and Galileo, they reject the skeptical dimension of Montesquieu's argument in the contrast between finite and absolute kinds of knowledge, as exemplified in the contrast between merely anthropological knowledge that we have versus God's knowledge that's absolute in every way, totally can't be revised, is set for all times. And for Bacon and Galileo, what they take away from the fallibility of our senses is the necessity for experimental data. So, like, yeah, all of our knowledge about the world is limited and finite and conditioned by all these various things, but all that points to for them is the importance of discovering those conditions through an experimental method in the natural sciences. And so, again, rather than appeal to the most universal kind of explanation, the most absolute kind of explanation that we would get from God. They're more interested at this point in setting up finite experiments to explain other finite events. And so you can kind of see how in the 16th, 17th century, you see a lot of reflections about the nature of our powers, the nature of God and religious authority. And you can see how those can come out in various directions. Like, you can be skeptical about our sense data and come out as an empiricist still. Like, you can believe that our senses are absolutely essential for us and that they don't provide us as much knowledge as we think that we do, as much knowledge as we think that we have. And this is going to be something that's relatively common. Hume is going to be a huge figure that we're going to discuss. We're going to spend a number of weeks examining him, and he brings these two components together as well, namely an empiricist approach and a generally sort of skeptical approach. But for Hume, it's ultimately going to be directed against religious authority rather than in favor of religious authority and against scientific approaches to trying to understand the world. But in general, you can kind of see during this period that there's sort of a constellation of problems surrounding around, like, what is our image of the world? What role, if any, does God play in those sort of explanations? How far do those explanations involving God really go? To what extent, what is natural science? And how is natural science possible? What sort of explanations are afforded by natural science? What sort of metaphysical hypotheses are we committed to if we believe in natural science? And so even though a lot of the religious dimension of this conflict is not here for us, like the church is not like an authority in a lot of people's minds in the 21st century as like determining like what you think, or like it's going to place you on house arrest or something like that. And so in that way, the context is different. But what really happens in this period is that a number of figures associate their common sense beliefs with a sort of religious outlook that went along with them. So like, for example, the Christian religious outlook says that you have a soul that will persist after your death, and that God is a divine lawmaker, that he is interested in how you decided to live your life, and that he will reward or punish you for how you decided to live. And for a lot of religious people during this time, this is very much caught up with common sense beliefs, but also sort of like ethical and political beliefs. Like, there's the belief that if you didn't hold these beliefs about, say, like the soul and God and your own freedom, that you would have no reason to act morally, because you wouldn't, if you say, stole a bunch of money and got away with it, that you wouldn't face judgment at the end of your life. And so for a lot of these thinkers, these apparently arcane disputes in religion and about sort of like metaphysical entities that we might think that we don't really care very much about it anymore. Like, a lot of philosophers, for example, don't really believe in a soul, at least in the same way that these Christian philosophers, religious authorities, and so on thought about the soul. They are caught up with common sense everyday beliefs that are still kind of with us, right? Like, even if we don't believe in a soul, maybe we believe in the idea of a self, right? And this comes out in a lot of the ways that we talk to each other. Like, you weren't yourself the other day. It's like a normal thing for someone to say. Like, you kind of understand that, right? It's like not spooky or weird or like philosopher talk to say that sort of thing, right? And for the thinkers of this period, this is very much caught up in a religious context. But the same sort of problems recur for us, right? So like, even if we get rid of the idea of a soul and we get like a completely different picture of moral motivation or whatever else, we can still ask, well, how and to what extent do our common sense beliefs about the world really cohere with what natural science tells us, right? And so a lot of the sort of problems that were encountered by early modern philosophers are still with us today. So to give you an example of how these problems might develop, so one science that was absolutely not available to early modern philosophers really in any way whatsoever was neuroscience, any science of the brain. And a lot of neuroscientific findings now at least challenge or complicate the idea of free will, because if you can give sort of like a natural scientific explanation of the way that your brain works, now it seems like we can give sort of like a natural scientific explanation of like how we interact with each other, the decisions that we make. We can say like, oh, you're feeling that way because you had like a dopamine rush, or like whatever. And then it sounds like we're explaining away selfhood in the same way that previous natural sciences try to explain away the soul. And so you can really see a lot of the problems that emerge in this period re-emerge as contemporary problems with the way that our common sense beliefs cohere with a natural scientific attitude and approach towards the world. And so in this class, we're going to be examining a lot of different perspectives of like, well, how well do those things gel together really? What can we keep? There's going to be some philosophers that think that not only do we have no idea of a soul, we have no idea of personal identity. Whereas others are going to argue that this is vitally important, that it's the only thing that we know for certain is that we have a self, and so on. And so we're going to get a whole range of perspectives that try to make sense together of the findings of natural science, and then at least what is right about a religious worldview, specifically for a lot of these figures, it's going to be a Christian or at least broadly monotheistic worldview at the time. What can we keep? And so these are problems that are very much still alive for us. And so I've written out just a few of the problems that are going to be core themes for the class. Sorry, there's a little bit of a glare, but it says central topics in early modern philosophy. And in general, I think that these are put into three different categories: metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. You might have heard the names of these in a previous class, man, it's really, yeah. So you might have heard about this in a previous class. Metaphysics is something like the nature of ultimate reality. So the sort of questions that early modern philosophers ask is like, is there a God? Is there a soul or a self? Are those different? What is that? Like, what is the thing that I think of as me, And then what is the nature of ultimate reality? What are substances? What is stuff? What is individual objects? How can I know what that is? We'll see if philosophers give very different accounts of that. And then epistemology, sort of questions about like, what can I know? How do I know that I know it? How can I be certain? And like, what is a scientific approach to these sort of questions instead of merely like folk approach or something to that extent. And then also philosophy of mind. This is going to be really important to this period, and one of the obvious ways that early modern philosophy is still relevant to us. What is a body? Like, I think I have a body, so like, what is that? What is the thing that's examined by physics when we say that, bodies interact in a physical environment, and, a ball rolls down a hill or whatever else, right? And then relatedly, what is a mind? What are we doing whenever we are trying to give explanations of bodies and how bodies interact? Is the mind in a body? Like, what is their relation? Is there a mind? These are sort of questions in philosophy of mind. And then I think they're all sort of related to a question that's like, what is the source of our ideas? And to what extent, really, do they justify our previously existing belief systems? And so these are going to be the questions that we focus on in early modern philosophy. It is true that, for example, there are a lot of early modern philosophical reflections about ethics or political philosophy and similarly related topics. But in general, what we really know this period for is this stuff. Really, a lot of the ethical and political dimension of a lot of these thinkers comes from how they think about the nature of the universe and how all of these different elements from belief systems, from natural science, from religion, cohere together and how we can make sense of them together. And so that's going to be basically what we're going to be investigating for the rest of this course is what are various perspectives on these sort of questions? How do we make sense of the emergence of natural science, and what does that do to our belief systems? How can we arrive at a form of knowledge that we think is immune to skepticism, that we think is certainly true, and we could not, find any reason to doubt? And so that's going to be a lot of the course, and we're going to continue on these very same themes next week with Descartes. This has gone a little bit longer than these videos will normally go, but I appreciate you watching. I'll see you next week.